Long before the age of kings or prophets, when the land of Israel was swallowed by fear, a shadow moved across the hills, a terror called Midian. They came like locusts, endless, ruthless, consuming everything in their path. Fields were burned, homes abandoned, and God's people hid in caves, starving in silence. And in that silence, one man was hiding too, a farmer, a nobody, threshing wheat in secret, praying no one would hear the sound. His name was Gideon. But heaven did hear. And when an angel spoke his name, the words did not match the man. The Lord is with you, mighty warrior. Mighty he was trembling, brave he was broken. Yet from the dust of fear, God was about to forge a weapon the world had never seen. This is not a story of numbers or armies, it's a story of divine paradox, where weakness becomes strength and faith becomes fire. A story that has been whispered through scripture and buried beneath centuries of silence. We reopen that silence. We trace the hidden signs, the impossible commands, and the miracle that defied reason. Because Gideon's battle was not just against Midian, it was against himself. Let's begin with the man who hid and was found. 7 years. That's how long the Midianites ruled the land, not with laws, but with fear. They descended like storms across the valleys of Israel, not to conquer, but to consume. Every harvest stolen, every flock taken, every dream burned to ash. Israel had sinned, and silence was their punishment. The people who once sang hymns of victory under Deborah now whispered their prayers in caves, too afraid to lift their voices. The sound of threshing wheat became a dangerous noise, the rhythm of survival hidden deep in hollow places. And there, in one of those hollows, we find him. Gideon, a young man, son of Joash, crouched low in a winepress meant for crushing grapes, not wheat. His hands trembled, dust clinging to sweat, eyes darting to the horizon. Each movement was a risk, each breath a secret. When faith hides underground, even daily, bread becomes a battle. He was not a warrior, he was not a prophet, just another man trying to survive the ruins of his father's faith. Yet deep within him, something unbroken stirred a question no fear could silence. Where is the God of our fathers now? The question itself was dangerous. But unanswered questions often become invitations. The Midianites weren't just enemies, they were symbols of how external oppression mirrors the inner collapse of faith. When Israel turned from the covenant, God allowed their idols to betray them and their enemies to define them. Every cave became a confession of what happens when belief retreats. The people cried out, but heaven was quiet, or so they thought. In truth, God was not absent, he was preparing, because divine silence is never empty. It's the pause before revelation. In the forgotten corners of Ophrah, where the wind pressed through the branches of an ancient oak, the unseen world was stirring. Angels listened. Destiny bent low, and somewhere beneath that same tree, a frightened farmer was about to be named, something he had never dared to imagine. Sometimes God does not search for the strong, he interrupts the hiding. The scene is set a broken nation, a fearful man, and a God whose answers come in fire, not comfort. And it's in that darkness that God chooses his most unlikely voice. The night air in Ophrah was still the kind of silence that holds its breath before the storm. Gideon worked alone, the sound of grain striking stone echoing in the hollow of the winepress. Above him, the oak branches swayed like dark arms stretching toward heaven, and then the air changed. A presence entered the silence. Not a man, not quite an angel as mortals imagine. The scripture calls him the angel of the Lord, a title so sacred that some believe it was the voice of God himself, clothed in flesh and light. He sat beneath the oak, watching Gideon, the frightened farmer, the hidden son, and then he spoke the words that shattered the stillness of fear. The Lord is with you, mighty warrior. Mighty warrior, he was just a man in hiding. Gideon froze, his breath catching like a trapped bird. Mighty warrior. The words mocked everything he believed about himself. He turned toward the stranger, anger trembling in his voice. If the Lord is with us, then why has all this happened? Where are all his miracles? Our ancestors told us about. It wasn't rebellion. It was exhaustion, the sound of faith trying not to die. The angel did not answer his complaint. Instead, he said something even more impossible. Go in the strength you have. I am sending you." The strength he had, there was none. He was the least in his family from the weakest clan of Manasseh. He had no sword, no army, no name worth remembering, yet the call remained. God doesn't wait for courage. He speaks into fear and names it faith. For every generation that hides behind doubt, Gideon's question echoes, "But how, Lord, why me?" And the whisper from heaven never changes, "Because I am with you." It's a truth as ancient as it is terrifying that God chooses not from the mighty, but from the trembling. He calls by destiny, not by resume. What man sees as small, God sees as strategic. What we call weak, heaven calls ready. Gideon didn't know it, but that single conversation beneath the oak would change the course of Israel's history. What began as a whisper in the dark would soon set fire to an entire nation. Yet even as the divine voice faded, doubt remained. Was it real? Could it be true? If God had truly spoken, Gideon needed proof, something tangible, undeniable, something that would burn away the last shadow of fear. Faith had been awakened, but belief demanded a sign. And so, trembling beneath the oak, Gideon began to prepare an offering, not knowing that what would happen next would defy reason itself. The air was heavy with dust and doubt. Gideon looked around, half expecting the mysterious visitor to vanish as suddenly as he had appeared. But the angel remained silent and still, as if waiting for something only Gideon could offer. He ran into his father's house and gathered what little he could: a young goat, some unleavened bread, a pot of broth. It wasn't much, but sacrifice rarely is. With trembling hands he placed the meat and the bread upon a rock beneath the oak. The air was so still he could hear his own heartbeat. The angel did not bless the food. He didn't taste it. He simply reached out with the tip of his staff, and fire erupted from the stone. It wasn't the gentle flame of a hearth. It was holy fire, alive, fierce, consuming. It devoured the offering in an instant, leaving no ash, no smoke, just silence and the echo of the impossible. In an instant, fear meets fire, and doubt turns to ashes. Gideon fell backward to the ground. The earth beneath him seemed to hum with unseen power. He covered his face, crying out, "Alas, sovereign Lord, I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face." He thought he would die because no mortal could look upon such glory and live. But then came a voice not from the angel, but from everywhere, from within him, from the air itself. "Peace be with you. Do not fear. You shall not die." The terror subsided, replaced by something heavier: realization. The sign was real, but so was his insecurity. When the divine reveals itself, it doesn't always erase fear, it exposes it. Gideon built an altar on that very spot and called it, "The Lord is Peace." It was the first altar raised in Israel in years, not for idols of stone or carved wood, but for the God who still speaks to the trembling. Yet as the flames faded, the weight of his calling grew clearer. This was not the end of a vision. It was the beginning of a war. A war not only against Midian, but against his own lineage, his own household, his own fears. The sun was setting, casting long shadows through the trees. Somewhere beyond those hills, Midianite camps glowed like embers in the night, an empire of cruelty waiting for a reckoning. The God who sent fire upon a stone was about to send fire into a man. Gideon didn't yet know it, but the next command would tear down something far closer than any enemy: the altar of his own father. Night had fallen over the hills of Ophrah. The fire that once consumed Gideon's offering had long faded, but its memory still burned within him. And yet doubt clung to his heart like the cold mist over the valley. The sign had been real, but so was his fear. He had torn down his father's altar to Baal, and by morning the whole town knew. They wanted him dead. But his father's voice silenced the mob. If Baal is truly a god, let him defend himself. For the first time, Gideon saw what courage looked like. Still, even courage can tremble when the call is divine. Miracles had come, yet Gideon's soul still whispered, "What if I heard wrong?" So under the cover of darkness, he set his test. He took a fleece of wool and laid it upon the threshing floor, that same hidden place where fear had once ruled him. He spoke softly into the silence, as if not to wake the sleeping heavens. "If you will save Israel by my hand, as you have said, then let the fleece be wet with dew and the ground around it dry." When dawn came, he reached down, and the fleece dripped with water. It was so full he wrung it out, and the dew poured like a stream between his fingers. The ground beneath was bone dry. God had answered, but faith once fractured doesn't heal overnight. He hesitated. Could it have been chance? Could the wind have played a trick? His voice quivered again. Do not be angry with me, Lord, but let me make just one more request. This time let the fleece be dry and the ground around it be wet. The next morning the miracle reversed. The fleece lay dry as sand while the earth shimmered with moisture. The dew kissed the dust but not the wool. It was undeniable. The God of Abraham had heard a man too afraid to believe his own calling. God is patient with honest doubt. He'd rather you ask in fear than pretend in faith. In that moment, Gideon understood something profound. The Almighty does not despise weakness. He refines it. Every question Gideon asked became an altar of trust. Every hesitation a doorway to deeper obedience. He looked to the horizon. Beyond those hills, the Midianite army spread across the valley like a swarm, countless as locusts, their camels like grains of sand. But the trembling farmer was no longer alone. The tests were over. The command was clear. It was time to move from questioning to conquering. Gideon gathered the tribesmen from Asher, Zebulun, Naphtali, and Manasseh. Thousands answered his call. For the first time in years, the sound of courage rose in Israel. But as the army formed, heaven spoke again, and what came next would defy all logic. God was about to prove that victory is never found in numbers, but in obedience. The dawn broke cold over the valley of Jezreel. In the distance, the Midianite camp sprawled across the land like a living sea. Thousands of tents, countless fires, the metallic clatter of swords echoing through the wind. Against them stood Gideon and 32,000 men who had answered his call. The odds were impossible, but at least now he wasn't alone. Then God spoke. You have too many men. The words struck harder than any enemy could. Too many. Against an army without number, Gideon stared at the horizon, where dust from the Midianite ranks rose like smoke from the mouth of Sheol. But the voice of God was unshaken. Tell the fearful to return home. He obeyed, and 22,000 men turned their backs and walked away. The sound of retreating footsteps filled the valley like a dirge. Gideon stood still, watching as courage thinned into silence. Faith is never tested in the noise of battle, but in the quiet of subtraction. 10,000 remained. It was still a fragile hope, but at least it was something. Until God spoke again. There are still too many. This time the command was stranger. Gideon was to lead the men to the water. Those who knelt to drink set aside. Those who brought the water to their mouths, staying alert, were chosen. When it was done, only 300 remained. From 32,000 to 300. 99% gone. God doesn't need numbers, he needs clarity. The camp grew eerily still. Where there had been shouting, there was now only the whisper of the wind through empty tents. Gideon looked around. The faces that remained were weathered, uncertain, but willing. They were not the strongest, not the fastest, not the famous. They were simply the ones who stayed. Night fell and the air was thick with tension. Gideon stood among his 300, the dim flicker of torches casting trembling halos of light over their faces. The vast silence was broken only by the distant murmur of the enemy, a monstrous hum that filled the night like a storm waiting to break. He could feel it, the impossible weight of trust pressing upon him. Every reduction had been a death to reason, a dismantling of safety. Yet in that emptiness, something sacred emerged. Sometimes God shrinks your resources to enlarge your trust. History would remember this moment not for its strategy, but for its surrender. No general in the world would begin a battle by disarming his own odds, but heaven was crafting a miracle that could not be mistaken for human effort. 300 men stood at the edge of eternity, armed not with power, but with obedience. Gideon raised his eyes toward the dark valley where the Midianites slept beneath the weight of their pride. The final act was near. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of firewood and iron from the enemy camp, and in that wind Gideon heard the whisper again. Now you will see that the battle is mine. The night was thick with anticipation. The valley stretched out before Gideon and his 300 men, an ocean of darkness broken only by the distant fires of the Midianite camp. The enemy slept unaware, a false peace draped over their ranks, while the air around Gideon's camp pulsed with the weight of divine expectation. In their hands, the soldiers clutched not swords but clay jars. Inside each one, a torch flickered like a heartbeat. Their breath caught in their throats, the only sound, the quiet shuffle of feet against the earth. The trumpets were ready, but their lips did not yet part. They waited, the silence heavy and pregnant with purpose. For all their numbers, for all their might, the Midianites slept blind to the storm approaching. The very sound of the wind whispered their doom. At the signal, Gideon raised his hand. The moment shattered the stillness. The crash of clay against stone echoed like thunder in the night. The jars broke in 1,000 pieces, and in the flickering light of the torches, the warriors shouted, "For the Lord and for Gideon." In that instant, the illusion of an army was born. The sound of 1,000 trumpets cut through the night, and the Midianites awoke in confusion, their minds caught in the chaos of the moment. It was a trick, a deception of light and sound. The enemy surged to their feet, weapons drawn, eyes wild with panic. But the fear did not belong to Israel. It was the Midianites who turned on each other. In their confusion, the first sword struck a brother, then another and another. The camp was thrown into disarray, men clashing with men, the confusion so thick it was impossible to tell friend from foe. The enemy panicked. 1,000 swords turned against each other, and no man from Israel even swung. The victory was not in the strength of the army, but in the obedience of the few. The Midianites were routed not by the might of human hands, but by the might of divine strategy. As the last of the enemy scattered, the ground littered with weapons and fallen soldiers, Gideon stood still, his heart pounding in disbelief. The impossible had happened. But as he watched the chaos unfold before him, a deep truth settled within him. Victory had come, but it wasn't the battle outside that would define him. It was the battle within. For in that moment, as the dust settled, Gideon's real struggle began. Not against Midian, but against the pride and fear that now stirred inside him. God had used the weak to defeat the strong, but would Gideon's heart remain humble? Would he keep the victory in its rightful hands? Or would the spoils of war, now in his grasp, turn his heart to stone? The battle was over. The Midianites lay in ruins, their numbers scattered, their terror turned to confusion. But for Gideon, the night was not yet finished. There was still work to be done. The kings of Midian, Zebah and Zalmunna, had fled, and they were not just prisoners of war, they were the final remnants of the evil that had tormented Israel. Gideon called his remaining men to pursuit. The moon hung heavy over the land as they pressed forward, leaving the smoke of the battle behind them. The road ahead was long and fraught with uncertainty, but there was one goal: capture the kings. But as they marched, Gideon's resolve was tested in a way he had not anticipated. In the town of Succoth, his army found refuge, but not support. The elders of Succoth, fearful of retribution from Midian, refused to provide bread and water for Gideon's men. They demanded proof that the kings were already in their grasp before offering aid. The sting of betrayal cut deep. These were his own people, his own tribe, and yet they hesitated when they should have stood strong. Victory is dangerous because it whispers, "You did this yourself." Gideon's anger flared like a firestorm. He vowed that once the kings were captured, he would return and punish the city of Succoth for its lack of faith. The words stung as they left his lips, the first seeds of vengeance planted in a heart that had once been humble. But his path was not without further trial. In the town of Penuel, another city of his own, the same story played out. The elders here too refused to help. Their fear outweighed their faith. The same question burned in Gideon's heart. Why would they not stand with the Lord's anointed? Why must the cost of faith be so high? Gideon could not understand. Hadn't God already delivered Israel? Wasn't this victory a gift from heaven? Why would his people who had been delivered from oppression not step forward to help those who had brought the deliverance? The weight of success was pressing on him now. The battle against Midian had been won by faith, but his battle against the pride of his own people and his own heart had only just begun. The pursuit of the kings had turned into a pursuit of something deeper. Gideon could feel the subtle shift from righteous zeal to vengeful anger. When faith turns to ego, the heart loses its way. What began as a calling becomes a crusade, and vengeance wears the mask of justice. Gideon, the man who had once obeyed without question, was now being swallowed by his own desires. The kings were finally captured, but the cost was greater than the price of war. The battle within Gideon was far from over. The kings of Midian were dead. Israel was free. The once crushed nation now stood in awe of the man who had done the impossible. From fear to triumph, Gideon had become a legend. His name spread through the tribes like fire through dry grass. They hailed him not just as a warrior, but as a deliverer. The people gathered around him, their voices rising in one request: "Rule over us, you, your son, and your grandson, for you have saved us from Midian." But Gideon, weary from battle and haunted by the cost of obedience, refused. "I will not rule over you," he said, "nor shall my son rule over you. The Lord shall rule over Israel." It was a moment of humility, but humility can be fragile when admiration becomes worship. The people pressed closer, bringing the spoils of war, golden earrings, ornaments, and robes taken from the fallen Midianite kings. Gideon accepted their gifts, but not for greed. He said he would make an ephod, a sacred garment, once worn by priests, symbolizing divine communication. But this ephod was not worn in the temple. It was placed in Ophrah, his own city. What began as a memorial of victory slowly turned into an object of devotion. Israel, who had been freed from idols, now found itself kneeling before another one. The enemy outside was defeated. The enemy inside was not. The ephod glittered under the sun, its gold a reflection of misplaced faith. People came from afar to see it, to touch it, to worship through it, until reverence turned into idolatry. The same hands that had torn down his father's altar to Baal now built a new snare for the nation. And Gideon watched. Perhaps he believed it was harmless, that this was simply remembrance. But idolatry never begins with rebellion. It begins with memory corrupted by pride. Sometimes victory plants the very seeds of downfall. The man who once tore down idols had unknowingly become a builder of them. His heart, once ablaze with holy fire, now flickered in the winds of peace and power. Israel had peace for 40 years under Gideon's leadership, but peace without vigilance breeds forgetfulness. Gideon's story is a haunting melody of both glory and flaw, a reminder that divine triumph does not guarantee human purity. God's power had lifted him from the dust, but pride had quietly led him back toward it. When the songs of victory fade, the silence that follows reveals what the heart truly worships. For 40 years the land was peaceful. Israel rested from the oppression that had once swallowed them whole. They prospered under the leadership of Gideon, who had seen them through the storm. His name was revered, his legacy etched into the hearts of his people. The land flourished, and Israel sang songs of victory, of freedom, of deliverance. But peace, like all fleeting things, began to grow brittle. When the man who had held the fabric of the nation together passed away, so too did the strength that had once bound Israel's heart. His death, though natural, was the end of more than a life. It was the end of an era. Peace returns, but only while he lives. In the silence that followed Gideon's death, something insidious began to stir. The people who had once cried out for deliverance now turned their backs. The victories faded into memory. The miracles faded faster. And as the years passed, the once vibrant worship of God turned to dust as Israel drifted back into idolatry. The altars to Baal, the false gods they had once renounced, slowly crept back into their homes, their cities, their hearts. And with every stone they laid, they buried deeper the lessons of their deliverance. The God who had saved them, the God who had been their refuge, was forgotten. The worship of idols had become the new normal. Gideon's legacy, once a beacon of divine intervention, was overshadowed by the people's collective amnesia. His name, once spoken with reverence, now echoed like a distant whisper. Miracles fade fast when memory isn't guarded by gratitude. The Israelites had forgotten the price of their salvation. They had forgotten the power of God that had worked through the least of them, and in forgetting they turned back to the very darkness they had once been freed from. The story of Gideon, the man who was called to lead a nation from despair to victory, had now become a lesson in what happens when God's people grow complacent, when the fire of deliverance is left to burn out without tending. As the years passed, the story of Gideon became a quiet echo in Israel's history, a warning that was forgotten just as quickly as the miracles that had once saved them. But for those who still listened, who still remembered, there was a flicker of hope that perhaps in the depths of their hearts they would return to the God who had once set them free. And so, as the final whispers of Gideon's story faded into the shadows of time, the question lingered. Would Israel ever remember, or would they repeat the cycle again? Gideon's story is not just about a man who conquered armies. It's about a God who conquered fear. It's about how the weak become warriors, not through their own strength, but through the presence of the Almighty. Gideon's journey reminds us that even when we feel most unworthy, God sees us for what we can become, not for what we are. If this story has stirred something deep within you, don't let it fade here. Share one line from Gideon's journey that spoke to your heart in the comments. Your words might reignite someone else's faith. If you're new here, hit like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter in this unfolding story. And stay close, because the next story will take us deeper into the forgotten battles of the Book of Judges. The story is far from over.